morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the Radical Democracy Conference. We are very excited to have you here today. For those of you who don't know the story, we're already legendary because this is a continuation of a class that we had in the fall 2010 on radical democracy with Professor Andreas Kalyvas, who's sitting in the corner, and with Professor Stathis Gunduri. The legend started before even the class started itself because there were 20 students on the wait list to register for the class. So we're hoping that this conference, two-day conference, will be a continuation of a conversation which we started last fall. And just to give you one small example of how exciting it was to be in that class, we would spend about 3 hours just discussing one page of a text and arguing about it. So I know that we sent to all told all the presenters here that they have 15 minutes time to present, but we might end up being here until 12 midnight. I don't know. Anyway, without further ado, our first panel today is on agonistic democracy, and the chair is of this panel is Professor Andreas Kalyvas, who is a professor here at the New School, and he also works himself on radical democracy, and it's a real pleasure to have him chair this chair. After this panel, we have a little bit of a coffee break, and then the opening remarks by Professor Kalyvas. I only want to say one more thing. We're very grateful to all the conference sponsors, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University, the Graduate Student Advisory Council at Columbia University, the Columbia Graduate School of Arts and Science, the Union of Political Science Students here at the New School, the University Student Senate, and the Department of Politics, and of course the Theory Collective at the New School, which is a student-run organization. I also, on my own behalf, want to thank all the co-organizers of this conference for their enthusiasm and for working with me on this. Thank you very much and welcome again.
So we'll start today. I'm very happy to be here and to chair the first panel. I thank you for coming early in this morning. So we have 4 papers. The presentations will last approximately for 15 minutes, so to allow for discussion. And I will be presenting each speaker before the presentation. So we will start with Jakeet Singh, a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He works on postcolonial thought, anti-imperial politics, feminist thought, and multiculturalism. And some of his work has appeared in Theory, Culture and Politics and Third World Quarterly. His talk is titled Radical Democracy Goes Global, and I suppose it's a critique of Chantal Mouffe, a recent term to globalization studies.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much to the organizers and to everyone for coming, and in advance to the discussant for taking the time to read the paper and to comment. Looking forward to the discussion. So the paper that I'm presenting is part of a larger co-authored project that's really, what it's trying to do is to situate a kind of a comparative project between theories of radical democracy arising from within modern Western political theory, and trying to compare that with notions of radical democracy emerging within writings and praxis of movements, especially social movements in the third and fourth worlds. And so we've started with Chantal Mouffe, and so this work, although I won't have a chance to really get into any of the comparative aspect, which I would have liked to have done, but there just isn't time. So this is more of a background about a kind of critique of Mouffe, that in a critique in a couple different senses, trying to provincialize her work to show the limits of it, and also to take the project to task to some, to interrogate it to some extent on especially issues related to its complicity with imperial forms of power and its inattentiveness to imperial forms of power. And this is Mouffe's work from her early work with Laclau to her most recent work and her turn to globalization studies and to the global scale and what radical democracy means on a global scale. And part of the impetus for this project is to think through the complicated aspects of thinking about democracy at a time when democracy is so imbricated with imperial forms of power and the difficulties of thinking through democracy when it's both kind of an imperial script and an emancipatory script, and the challenges that poses for theorists, especially those aligned with global justice movements and social movements in subaltern social movements in the third and fourth worlds. So my paper focuses on 6 critiques. They are 1, the priority of philosophy, 2, the hegemony of hegemony, 3, the singularity of legitimacy, 4, the monism of radical democracy, 5, the longing for social democracy, and 6, the coloniality of modernity. And I'll go through each of those briefly. I'm not going to have a chance to really go through kind of more full account in the paper of Mouffe's theory of radical democracy, but I think there'll be enough in the critical sections to, and maybe assuming a little bit of background to make the discussion hopefully coherent. Okay, so the first, well, let me say first that I do share a number of commitments, and our reason for engaging with Mouffe and Laclau and Mouffe is we have a number of overlaps with and shared commitments and sympathy with a number of the interventions that Mouffe has been engaged with for the last 3 decades. In particular, I appreciate her foregrounding of questions of power, contingency, and contestation, her call for a politics of articulation among diverse struggles and movements, her critiques of post-political liberalisms and their illusions of a fully inclusive demos, her recognition of irreducible pluralism and difference, and her critiques of liberal democratic universalism and the hegemony of a single US-led neoliberal global order. Nonetheless, though, I want to go through each of these 6 critiques that perhaps show both that this theory is rather limited in its radical aspirations and somewhat complicit with imperial forms of power, which it does not take seriously enough. So the first, the priority of philosophy. And what I mean by this is basically that there's a priority of philosophy here rather than a priority of structure or practice. So basically, upon a closer examination, although Mouffe does claim that her theory, one of the things that makes her theory different, especially from other liberal democratic theories, is that it actually calls for a profound transformation of structural power relations. Upon a closer look, it really doesn't appear that this is the case. Mouffe actually has very little to say about radical democracy as a leftist project of structural transformation. Rather, her form of radical democracy is really a kind of self-understanding. It's a kind of philosophical or epistemological critique of the form of justification or the self-understanding of liberal Democrats in order to take greater account of the importance of hegemony and the centrality of antagonism. And so really, when it comes down to actually talking about a kind of partisan leftist structural project, she actually does not have a great deal to say. And we can see this in a number of aspects that she discusses with respect to the benefits of radical democracy in her view. And part of that is that it allows for antagonistic relations to take an agonistic form, and this includes some of our concerns here are right-wing populist movements and how contemporary forms of liberal democratic justification and rationalism really can't take account of certain movements, and so it exacerbates certain antagonisms rather than allowing them to take an agonistic form. So it's kind of clear that radical democracy is actually a kind of self-understanding that's actually supposed to be adopted by both people on the right and left, and so it's not actually a political project, but a kind of meta project for all across the political spectrum to transform their antagonisms into a more agonistic form. So really, Mouffe doesn't have much to say about any particular forms of democratic practice or participation by citizens. It outlines very few economic transformations that would be important for radical democracy. It does not ask for a realignment of the relationship between governors and governed. It abstracts away from any of the place-based or other important features of particular democratic communities, and it demands little in terms of specific transformations of the standard low-intensity political institutions of modern representative democracy. So that's the first. The second is the hegemony of hegemony, and this phrase, the hegemony of hegemony, comes from a critique of Mouffe and Laclau by Richard Day, who's working in a kind of anarchist, post-anarchist tradition in solidarity with a number of indigenous social movements as well. And the critique here is of this kind of ontology of the political that takes hegemony as so central, and hegemonic projects as so central to the political. And what these critiques, these anarchist, post-anarchist, anarcho-indigenous traditions want to say, among a lot of other traditions, is they want to contrast a kind of politics of hegemony with a politics of affinity, and a kind of horizontalist, network-based work among a number of social movements who aren't really looking for a politics of hegemony per se, with its emphasis on a common point of closure and a point of collective decision-making that's enforced on the whole, which is kind of the central features of this kind of hegemonic project, according to Mouffe. But they want to focus instead on these affinity-based, horizontalist network projects among diverse movements and building from the ground up alternatives. And these activist practices and micro-political projects, they focus instead on ethical, cultural resistance and transformation, alternative building practices, structural renewal from the ground up, and or social rather than political revolution. And so you find strands of this kind of thought, as I've said, in a number of anarchist, autonomist, feminist, indigenous movements. And so I think it's important to take this seriously, that a lot of these kinds of movements are not actually, and have explicitly critiqued the state form and this hegemonic politics, and they're not actually looking to the state or the institutional regime to demand forms of recognition, rights, representation, redistribution, inclusion, and integration, but are instead, in many cases, looking to build subalternized traditions and to experiment with practices of these from the ground up. So I think it's important to take these into consideration and how the hegemony of hegemony kind of blocks these practices from view. Number 3, the singularity of legitimacy. This has to do with an argument that Mouffe has argued repeatedly in her work, that suggests that A, every political regime is founded on a discrete set of principles of legitimacy, and B, no political regime can tolerate conflicting principles of legitimacy within its midst without endangering its very survival. So Mouffe kind of pictures a kind of what it appears a kind of constitutionally bounded political regime that basically these kind of constitutional principles establish the kind of political grammar, she explicitly says this, the kind of political grammar of the political community, and there will be competing interpretations of these principles. That's what she calls the kind of conflictual consensus. But really, she maintains a hard line and actually agrees with Rawls and Habermas on the exclusions necessary in a liberal democratic regime of non-liberal democratic politics. Kind of hard line there, but she just wants to say it's not a rationalist justification for that exclusion, it's a political justification for that conclusion, or that exclusion. And so she is very much committed to this idea that really the only kinds of politics that are available in a radical democracy are a kind of immanent critique of the constitutional, the basic kind of founding principles of any polity. And I want to argue that this is actually a profoundly conservative move, and it blocks out all kinds of different revolutionary and subaltern forms of politics, indigenous forms of politics, that often rely on very different traditions of politics, appeal to different principles of legitimacy, and want to assert these over and against the political communities often into which they've been incorporated unwillingly. And it actually labels these kinds of movements as basically enemies of the state, and doesn't allow space there. So the radicality here of radical democracy is kind of in question, and Mouffe expresses along these lines a kind of disdain for legal pluralism, and really even quite conventional moves towards a kind of deep diversity, which this kind of limiting of principles of legitimacy, this kind of container of politics, really seems to limit out. Number 4, the monism of liberal democracy. For Mouffe and Laclau, they're very clear from the start that radical democracy is actually radical liberal democracy. It's an attempt to live up to the ideals of freedom and equality, and to actually promote these values, and to exclude others, and to promote liberal democratic forms of subjectivity. And so they're very clear that this is an immanent critique of liberal democratic norms, and that a radical democracy should be a conflictual consensus on freedom and equality. What I want to say here is that it really neglects a huge strand of multiculturalist and postcolonial thought that has, for a very long time, critiqued liberal democracy and at least tried to provincialize liberal democracy, and to foreground its subalternizing effects of alternative traditions, and how the complicity of liberal democracy with imperial forms of power, often its language of legitimacy, actually means that liberal democracy has certain subalternizing effects that we have to pay attention to alternative forms of politics. And postcolonial anti-imperial thinkers have really foregrounded this for a long time, and that's kind of off the radar here. 5, the longing for social democracy. And all I want to say here briefly is basically that when Mouffe does talk about some kind of leftist political project, really it's a kind of lament for the lack of backbone of social democratic parties, and the fact that they don't champion strong redistributive kind of Keynesian politics. So it's actually a very, when she actually gets around to saying things about leftist politics, very conventional longing for social democracy that you find in Laclau and Mouffe and her subsequent sole authors' works. And 6th, perhaps the kind of underpinning of much of the critique is the coloniality of modernity. And what I want to say here is that in much of this work, Mouffe asserts the modern character of radical democracy, reinforcing that with a kind of meta-narrative about the transition to modernity and the dissolution of markers of certainty that come with that, and the rise of pluralism that she sees as basically the same as modernity and the rise of liberal democracy. And so she really asserts this modern character of radical democracy. And what's ignored here again, and this modern story is actually told internal to the West. She talks about modernity as a story in relation to the ancients or pre-moderns within the West, so it's an internal story to the West. And what she ignores is a now increasingly well-developed literature, the best of which goes under the heading of the Modernity Coloniality Research Program, best articulated by Arturo Escobar. And the idea here is that modernity can't be talked about without coloniality. And coloniality is really all that's that is subalternized by the modern project. And so it takes seriously here modernization as the key imperial and civilizational discourse of our time, and its subalternizing effects on all kinds of different cultural knowledge forms, political forms, and so Escobar goes through a few things that are distinct about this this modernity coloniality perspective, and I'll just wrap up with this. So he says the modernity and coloniality always have to be understood together. There's an emphasis on locating the origins of modernity with the conquest of the Americas and the control of the Atlantic after 1492, to a persistent attention to colonialism and the making of the capitalist world system as constitutive of modernity, and a world perspective then on modernity, rather than an intra-Western perspective. So these 6 critiques are really aimed towards provincializing this radical democratic project so that we can see other forms that are practice-based, place-based projects rather than philosophy-based, that prioritize a non-state-centered politics, that recognize the interplay of a wide diversity or deep diversity of principles of legitimacy within political communities, that provincialize liberal democracy as one normative tradition among others, but one that wields great hegemonic and assimilative power. Projects that enact a more thorough reconceptualization of leftist politics, especially through practices of non- or post-capitalist politics. And projects that place at the heart of their struggles a critique of colonial, including settler colonial and imperial forms of knowledge power, including those that continue to operate within the struggle over radical democracy itself.
The next paper is by Kalyvas, a PhD student in the history of art at the University of Edinburgh. He works on a PhD project entitled Activism, Activity, Activation, Transformations of Community in Contemporary Art. Today's talk will be Us and Them, the production of the common in the work of Artur
Zmijewski.
Good. Thank you.
First of all, can I be a pain in the neck and go and stand over there to do it? So to do slides, being token art person, I need pictures. So, that still works. Okay. The deployment of political philosophy and theory as a means of explicating contemporary art practice has a long history. Tracing the conflation of aesthetics and politics in theoretical text provides a lineage of writers which passes through Kant, Adorno and Bloch towards the present day, and that ubiquitous presence in contemporary art theory, Jacques Rancière. In recent years, art has undergone what Claire Bishop has described as a social turn, an increased emphasis on participatory, collaborative, socially or community-engaged practice. This has engendered a necessity for the theorization of such practice in the context of political theory, and especially those writers who form the conceptual basis for this conference, such as Mouffe, notably cited by Claire Bishop, Hart Negri in Okwi Enwezor's essays for the Documenta 11 exhibition in Kassel, Germany, for instance, and the aforementioned Rancière, cited near enough everywhere. This paper, I will freely admit, joins this throng of magpie-ish borrowers, However, I hope my correlation of contemporary art and radical democratic theory will be shown to be urgent and far from gratuitous. Today, I shall focus on the Polish artist Artur Zmijewski, and in particular his 2007 half-hour-long video piece, Them. Zmijewski's work has not only garnered widespread attention and discussion, but has also acted as a vanguard for a tendency within art, which has largely since the initial exhibition of Them, placed an increased emphasis on issues of community through a performative mode. I would like to propose that in Them, a concurrency is demonstrated between concerns in contemporary art and what Hart and Negri describe as the spiral symbiotic production of the common and production of subjectivity. In this paper, firstly, I shall demonstrate how Them relates to this formulation of the production of the common, and secondly, I shall attempt to explain where this work, and indeed socially or politically engaged artistic practice as a whole, situates itself in relation to both political theory and political activism. In Them, originally exhibited at Documenta 12, one of the more prestigious international exhibitions of recent years, the artist adopted the experimental art college techniques of his own tutor, Gregor Kowalski, as the framework for the piece. He invited 4 groups to enter into an artist studio situation, replete with a plethora of materials, and asked them to create artworks which they believed manifested the identities of their groups. The 4 groups comprised a right-wing Polish nationalist youth group, a Catholic women's organisation, members of left-wing youth movements, and young Polish Jews. Each was asked to spend time initially creating their own artwork discreetly from the other groups, and so, for instance, the nationalist group created a grand-scale depiction of the Szerbiets, the coronation sword of the former Polish monarchy, and the symbol of the all-Polish youth movement, entwined with the red and white colours of Poland. Then each group was asked to modify or correct the image, modify or correct the other's creations. The left-wing group proceeded to cut the sword out of the original image, leaving a blank space where it originally stood. Increasingly, the group's actions become ever more violent and vitriolic, until eventually the studio was engulfed in flame and smoke after one canvas was doused in petrol and set alight. The spiral nature of Them is evident in the basic infrastructure of the work. We begin with 4 groups, each presenting a subjectivity, a political or religious viewpoint. The art workshop process then not only allows these subjectivities to be relayed, but to become sources of yet more collaboration and cooperation through the encouragement by the artist for the groups to adapt and modify each other's works. Each modification represents a negotiation of subjectivities through a common production process into more advanced subjectivities, informed by another level of this cooperation and collaboration. The workshop takes place over 4 sessions, each utilising the same format. And so what emerges is both a horizontal motion, the modifications and collaborations which occur within each session, and a vertical motion, the movement from session to session. This simultaneous horizontal and vertical movement generates an infrastructural spiral intrinsic within the formalities of the piece, which necessitates a perpetual motion away from pre-existing subjectivities, concurrently around and upwards. As Hart and Negri state, in this spiral, each successive movement from production of subjectivity to production of the common is an innovation that results in a richer reality. Throughout the work, 2 forms of linguistics are employed by the participants as a means of negotiating their commons and their subjectivities. Firstly, through visual communication, through the production and modification of artworks, and secondly, through oral discussion, debate, argument. The 2 often interweave and complement each other as dialogical tools between the groups. For instance, an image of a church produced by the Catholic women's group is initially depicted on a flat canvas, the doors of the church painted in a black outline. The left-wing youth group proceeds to cut open the doors of the church, generating a pair of operational swinging doors for this painted church, a visually communicative act. Verbal discussion follows. One of the Catholic group announces, "I like the idea of opening the church door very much." A new coalition is formed. A new collaboration is produced, which, however temporary, constitutes produced commons. Each debate and discussion forms such new alliances, new understandings of what rhetoric to employ with different people and different groups. Thus, language is actively being produced in common. As Hart and Negri state, it is never the product of an individual, but rather is always created by a linguistic community in communication and collaboration. I have, however, thus far ignored the one element of the work which seems to contradict, or at the very least, problematize the status of them as embodying notions of the production of the common. Hart and Negri discussed the issue of exploitation, relating it to the production of the common as follows. Exploitation today tends to act directly on our performances through the control of the common by capital. Could one not view the incessant appearances of Zmijewski himself? This is him here, and it's a bit difficult to see, but that's him anyway. Could one not view the incessant appearances of Zmijewski himself in the piece not only as a form of control of the common? The artist intervenes in production, indeed even establishes the preconditions for production, but also as control by capital. Let us for a moment examine the relationship between artist and participants. The artist exhibits worldwide, his reputation growing, commission checks increasing in quantity and value. He will next year curate the Berlin Biennale and is regularly commissioned to produce what essentially amount to variations, if not absolute recreations, of this work for substantial sums. And yet this success is predicated on an artistic practice in which unpaid volunteers devote labour to the artist in a relatively unquestioning and numb fashion. There is little suggestion within the work that the participants appreciate the financial gains headed Zmijewski's way as a result of their efforts. These participants are what Gregory Chalet has described as dark matter in the book of the same name, hidden producers, invisibles, vitally important to the art world, but never recognised. While one could view the artist's interventions as attempts at prompting and furthering dialogue, discussion, and the production of the common amongst participants, it is hard to ignore this suggestion of exploitation. For one thing, the action takes place in the artist's studio, a problematic site which I don't have time to go into detail here. What is important, however, is that it happens on the artist's terms, in his space. Furthermore, Zmijewski says at the outset, our game begins here, a hint at the power relations between dominant artists and subservient participants. So, if art is fundamentally tied into a system of capital, which is necessarily exploitative of the production of the common, what agency does it have in discourse surrounding this subject, and indeed surrounding politics in general? In a recent article for The Guardian newspaper in the UK, entitled Arabs Are Democracy's New Pioneers, Hart and Negri write of recent events in the Middle East. Our hope is that through this cycle of struggles, the Arab world becomes a laboratory of political experimentation. There is a danger that such events in countries deemed third world may be what Hamid Dabashi, in response to Slavoj Žižek's remarks on Iran, called theoretical entertainment, a distant crucible of unrest to be analysed by academics with suitable detachment for it to be merely a conceptual consideration. The biopolitical impact of this unrest gets somewhat obscured by a veil of intellectualism. Art, perhaps, provides an alternative laboratory of political experimentation, in that paradoxically, its lack of agency may in fact be its source of agency. By this I mean to suggest that art generally deals with more diminutive biopolitical currencies than real life. The stakes are, on the whole, considerably lower. Thus, art may provide a site for political experimentation, where theoretical entertainment does not veil great biopolitical tragedy, rather it replaces it. Furthermore, the relative autonomy bestowed upon the art world in its position as theoretical entertainment, the ability to transgress ethical norms being one example of this, while robbing it of direct political influence, allows it to act as such a laboratory in which boundaries can be pushed further than is possible in other circumstances. The extent of exploitation has been the boundary most tested by artists dealing with this issue of production of the common. One need only look at the post-colonial posturing of Renzo Martins, or indeed the casting of participants as prisoners in Zmijewski's repetition, for this to become clear. These still constitute experimentations in the same sphere as Hart and Negri discuss. They are theoretical examinations of the production of the common, paradoxically operating within a system of control by capital, while simultaneously demonstrating this control in ever more extreme fashions, prompting increased discourse surrounding the nature of the inherent exploitation, and thus, at a secondary level of examination, the exploitations inherent in society. In the words of Patricia Phillips, art acts as an investigation, not an application. Thus, with this new laboratory site, a new problematic arises, namely this issue of exploitation. While Zmijewski and the artists who have followed him actively participate in discourse surrounding the production of the common, the inflection we place on this term needs to be shifted in order to accurately reflect the issues raised by the artworks and the context they are created in. The common should not be italicized, should not be the form of the focus of inquiry. Rather, it is production that requires our attention. It is production that must be italicized.
So the third presentation is by Alexander Keller Hirsch, who is a lecturer in political science at Northeastern University and a doctoral candidate in politics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Hirsch has published, edited a collection of essays entitled The Agon of Reconciliation, and I suppose his presentation will relate with this theme, and its title, Fugitive Reconciliation, the Agonistics of Respect, Resentment, and Responsibility in Post-Conflict Society.
Thank you. Before launching before I launch the paper, I wanted just also to thank the conference organizers, and especially Paulina, who was a constant email interlocutor. It looks like a really promising event, and I'm honored to be here. And also thank Cruz for agreeing to read 4 panel papers and comment on this lot of work. And lastly, to thank the audience for agreeing to come so early to a panel on agonists, which is not always the cheeriest of early morning topics. And, with 15 minutes allotted, I really have time just to give a caricature of the paper I'm presenting. So I'm going to drop some of the details. I hope this doesn't screw you up any, Chris. The readings I give, especially as a gamin, in the interest of streamlining things a little bit and focus more on the most polemical aspect of my argument in order to most effectively raise questions and debate. The paper I'm presenting today is concerned with the subject of transitional justice, and especially recent political theoretical efforts to reckon with how societies divided by a history of violence and trauma can shore up a new, more just era after evil. Historically, transitional justice, both as a field of scholarly interest and as a tactic of repair, starts with the Nuremberg trials at mid-century. Since then, a host of mechanisms of redress have been concocted. The ethnic violence committed against Armenians, Tutsi, Bengalis, the Ashe in Paraguay, Timorese, Southern Sudanese, as well as countless others who have experienced mass terror and political violence in places like Northern Ireland, Chile, South Africa, and Uganda, exemplifies the range and scene and setting where measures of transitional justice have been taken up. In each case, the effort has been to reconstitute a shared sense of being in common, embodied in the mutual invocation of a common we. In pursuing these ends, transitional justice regimes often rely upon a set of paradigmatic institutions: truth commissions, official apologies, public confessionals, reparations, legal tribunals, etc. Much of the transitional justice literature has been focused on a vision of reconciliation as communitarian social harmony. Through collective acts of apology and forgiveness, so the argument goes, restoration is imparted, and the writhing conflict of the past is substituted for the overlapping consensus of community. On this score, reconciliation means engendering relations of equanimity between historical antagonists based on reciprocal recognition, reverence, and above all, agreement. In many ways, at its root, this approach owes itself to the work of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas. For Rawls, famously, serious conflicts must be adjudicated before political society can be cultivated. Faced with the fact of reasonable pluralism, Rawls argues, a liberal view removes from the political agenda the most divisive issues, serious contention about which must undermine the bases of social cooperation. Habermas, like Rawls, stresses the democratic virtue of pre-established agreement, with the distinction that his is a communicatively achieved consensus. For both, agreement is idealized and rational, conducted through the public use of reason, and above all vital to the normative functioning of politics. And yet, when applied to cases of transitional justice, several questions arise which bedevil some of Rawls's and Habermas's assumptions. If resolve must be achieved in order for politics to begin, and deep disagreement must be ruled out ahead of time, how ought we to cope politically with conflicts that remain fundamentally irresolvable? Does not the bracketing of difference work to suspend precisely that which must be actively confronted if reconciliation is to be achieved? How would such a model of justice, which seeks to reunite a divided society by adjourning difference, avoid promoting in practice a resolution that looks more like surrender by the victim to the perpetrator than harmonizing reconciliation? How might the work done in mollifying past discord further debase and politically neutralize the victims of abuse in need of reconciliation and repair in the first place? My paper starts with these questions. It argues that some, if not most, of the angles of approach and normative modes of address and popular conclusions reached by transitional justice thought fall short, or worse, unwittingly perpetuate the very injustices they aim to suture. In some cases, an injunction to move on, to leave the painful past behind in the name of a conciliatory future is too quickly prescribed, resulting in the repression rather than the release of the traumatic event. In still others, an insidious act of reification takes place in the call for reconciliation between hostile factions. In places like Rwanda or Bosnia, there is no past point of pacific social relations to return to. In calling for reconciliation or restoration, the messy historical reality of the conflict in question is obfuscated and erased from view. In exploring the possibility for an alternative approach to post-conflict thought, I turn to some recent efforts in the paper to read reconciliation through radical democratic, new realist, and especially agonistic lenses. It makes sense to read reconciliation as an agonistic event for several reasons. For one, agonism stresses the often irresolvable character of constitutive tensions at the heart of a political community. Rather than jettison serious disagreements in the name of pacifying settlement, agonism affirms struggle, friction, divisiveness, and rupture as endemic to political life. Thus, agonism affords post-conflict thought a valuable point of departure otherwise subdued by liberal and deliberative theories of transition, namely the source and thrust of the disharmony generated out of the conflict itself. Though I work to accentuate this agonistic approach to reconciliation, I focus in the paper on developing a caveat meant to productively complicate such approaches. The challenge is framed in two parts. The first concerns what is commonly referred to as agonistic respect, or sometimes William Connolly calls it critical responsiveness. Agonism, as many have pointed out, aims to mediate conflict in such a way that the other is not perceived as an enemy to be destroyed, but as an adversary, i.e. one with whom we disagree vehemently, but whose right to contest the terms of our political association we ultimately respect. Instead of encouraging citizens to bracket their moral and cultural disagreements, agonistic Democrats suggest that we cultivate oppositional yet respectful civic and political relations and practices. But just how different is this conception from the overlapping consensus agonists are otherwise right to mistrust? If conflict, in order to qualify as agonistic, requires a civic form of enmity to structure disagreements, then don't those disagreements require participants to engage in an overlapping consensus of their own, where adversaries agree to disagree non-violently? What's more, in the demand that conflicts be necessarily non-violent, doesn't agonism betray its own suspicion of such attempts to determine in advance what is to count as legitimate political action? My second challenge concerns another category of perennial concern for agonistic Democrats, a site many have turned to in re-theorizing reconciliation from radical democratic advantages, namely responsibility. Though I agree that critical theories of responsibility should play an important part in agonistic reconciliation, I remain dubious insofar as most take mutual respect to be responsibility's main condition of possibility. In making this argument, an argument against that position, I take Agamben's theorization of responsibility in his book Remnants of Auschwitz as a case in point. In the context of his discussion of the scale of violence represented in the Holocaust, Agamben introduces what he calls non-responsibility. Not to be confused with some kind of nihilistic amorality, non-responsibility for Agamben signifies what he calls a confrontation with responsibility infinitely greater than we could ever assume. On this score, the only appropriate measure of responsibility taken for a catastrophe of such formidable proportion as the Holocaust would be an unassumable one. Despite its unassumability, non-responsibility remains an imperative toward which its subjects must remain true. As Agamben puts it, the confrontation with a responsibility greater than that we could ever assume also necessitates that we remain faithful to it, that is, assert its unassumability. Agamben's account can be read as a vision of non-responsibility as an infinite project, without end, unachievable and yet interminable. So for Agamben, responsibility, it's unattainable, but it's also unavoidable. In qualifying his position, Agamben argues contrary to philosopher and Holocaust survivor Jean Amery, who, in holding fast to an ethics of resentment, Agamben argues, simply refuses to accept that what happened, happened. In his At the Mind's Limits, Amery writes that after Auschwitz, a forgiving and forgetting is induced by a social pressure that is immoral. By contrast, the moral person demands annulment of time, in the particular case under question, by nailing the criminal to his deed. That's Amery's words. Agamben reads Amery's appeal for the annulment of time as a tacit plea for Auschwitz's eternal return. And yet, as Agamben writes, one cannot want Auschwitz to return for eternity, since in truth, it has never ceased to take place. It is always already repeating itself. And this interminable recurrence is due, of course, for Agamben to the unassumability of responsibility for the event. I don't like Agamben very much. And so I turn instead in the paper to Sheldon Wolin, who I think offers us a more potent alternative for an agonistics of reconciliation. And I'm particularly taken with his essay, which is now becoming very well known, Fugitive Democracy, which hopefully you read in your graduate seminar with Andreas Kalyvas. In Fugitive Democracy, in that article, Wolin introduces a conception of democracy that is opposed to constitutionalization. Democracy, on Wolin's account, is resistant to domestication. It is unenclosed and unrestrained. It's something like a feral force. Impulsive and unprompted, democracy is destined to be volatile and precarious. And what I would like to suggest is that Wolin's fugitive politics offers a potent alternative to Agamben's non-responsibility. Instead of a theory where reconciliation is forever delayed, that's, I think, Agamben's position, Wolin sketches a notion of time where the moment of the political, or on the reading I'm giving here, the moment of reconciliation, would represent an epiphanic flash. That's Wolinian language. Reconciliation, an experimental temporal struggle, would ebb and flow. In place of Agamben's theory of pure potentiality, Wolin intimates one of perpetual possibility. Rather than something that is always about to come, reconciliation would be conceived as something which actually takes place, albeit fleetingly, bursting onto the scene only to vanish at the moment it is sublimated into an institutionalized form. For Wolin, the recurrence of the disruptive, spontaneous moment of reconciliation would persist everlastingly so long as its memorialization remains unbroken. And this is what, if we follow Wolin to the end, reconciliation would mean in the agonistic mode, a wild and disorderly temporal rupture where the resentments of the victims of atrocity accumulate and split open the present, and the startling invocation of a bygone past continues to haunt the present as a fugitive moment. Affirming Wolin's fugitive democracy in the context of agonistic reconciliation means asserting precisely that which Agamben rejects in Amery, I think. Amery replaces Agamben's respect with resentment as the ground upon which responsibility and responsiveness is founded for politics of reconciliation. And I think this is a conception of reconciliation agonists should be attracted to. Insofar as agonism asserts the political value of contestation and heteronomy, the virtues of remembrance, resentment, and non-identity ought to replace those of respect as the hallmarks for a theory of responsibility. If we take Wolin's to be a view important for the re-theorization of reconciliation, democracy might be rethought as a tactic of agonistic repair reserved for the fugitive moments lived in our transitional contexts. If Democracy denotes a sporadic and erupted flash of memory that calls into being the constituent power of the demos, revived by the temporal discontinuity of the conjuring past. The fugitive reconciliation may ultimately amount to the political acts par excellence. Thank you.
The last presentation is by Juan Pablo Ferrero, who is currently a PhD student and a teaching fellow in Hispanic Studies at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. His work focuses on social movements, trade unions, and democracy in South America, and his presentation today is called Agonistic Democratic Subjectivities in South America, from Disagreement to Participation.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'd like to join Alexander in thanking Paulina especially for her help and Chris for reading our papers. I'm very honored to participate in this conference as well. This paper reflects is based on my PhD research that broadly seeks to understand the role of trade unions and social movement organizations and their connections somehow broadly with the process of democratization, contemporary history in Argentina and Brazil. I will present some notes on the context of the past 30 years in which my research is located, and some very brief notes on the theoretical bits in which I draw on, and then I'll focus on the core of my paper to hopefully spark some debate afterwards. The past 30 years, there were basically three very important moments in the history of Argentina and Brazil, at least. In the 80s was the transition from dictatorship to democracy, alongside the so-called debt crisis. In the 90s, the implementation of structural adjustment programs, neoliberal policies, and so-called consolidation or stability in terms of the political regimes. And in the year 2000, still unfolding, some people talk about the pink tide or something new is happening. We still don't know what is it about. In terms of confessions, my PhD in a sense tries to contribute to the debate on democracy in the region, which I think is very much still dominated by the so-called transition school, which emphasis on institutions and the concept of civil society has somehow underscored the role of alternative organization forms and social movement organizations, etc. In order to seriously challenge this perspective, my objective is by drawing on radical democracy literature, research currently existing practices, actors, and processes. Radical democracy literature offers a less explored theoretical framing, at least in what democracy debate in the region is about. And it's an interesting tool to interrogate democracy and democratization. I agree with Laclau and Mouffe that the question of political identity is crucial to scrutinize democratic politics. The quest for democratic subjectivities lies between ideas and political identity, understood as mode of identification. While political identity refers to the ultimate abstract idea behind radical democracy, i.e. the constitution of the people, mode of subjectification in turn refers to the essentially incomplete, therefore partial and contingent constitution of the former. Democracy is both the effort to organize the political space around the universality of the community and the respect for differences, and the universalization of either of these tendencies leads to a perversion of democracy as a political regime, in the words of Laclau. The relationship between political identity and modes of identification is mediated by the practice of articulation, defined as the creation of change of equivalences among democratic struggles, in the words of Mouffe and Laclau as well. Understanding the constitution of democratic subjects in line with the notion of political identity is aligned with Rancière's argument for whom the democratic scandal resides in revealing precisely the discretion behind the distribution of places, partaking, and functions. That is why, in Rancière's terms, although politics is rare, it is only through democracy, the absence of the principle to rule, where politics, the interaction of effects of domination, can emerge. My exploration of democratic subjectivity in the Southern Cone is therefore informed by the politics of partaking and the process through which the part who have no part, in the words of Rancière, enters a process of recognition which inevitably entails the creation of chains of equivalence, unification, and a position of differentiation. I have developed, and this is the core of my paper, I think, analytical framework, because although I think the radical democracy debate has a lot to contribute to democracy debate in the region in general, I think there is a gap between the philosophical ideas that the radical democracy provides and what's currently unfolding on the ground somehow. So my research also tries to fill this gap somehow. I have developed an analytical framework which is a result of emerging thing from data. I've been doing field work for 6 months both in Brazil and Argentina, analyzed in the light of radical democracy principles. So somehow this analytical framework put these two spheres together. This analytical framework, of course, in principle, is only applicable to my case studies. And my case studies, just to mention them, I've worked especially with the CUT in Brazil and the MST. So one trade union central and one so-called social movement organization. And similar in Argentina, I took the Housing Federation, FTV, and the CTA, which is a relatively new, I mean, it emerged in the early 90s, trade union central. This analytical framework holds three relatively stable dynamics, or non-territorial spaces, as I call it, and the constitution of one unstable and overarching logic. First, the relatively stable dynamics, or non-territorial spaces, I call them organizing, networking, and demanding, using the gerund form in order to convey this idea of ongoing practices. In general, these non-territorial spaces, I think they both describe, on the one hand, a sociological phenomenon that is taking place, and on the other hand, reveal the production of an invisible dynamic, which I argue pose a challenge to subtle and different forms of domination. Non-territorial spaces are produced by territorial actors, which are in turn produced by this dynamic. So there is a two-way kind of action. Briefly, then, organizing, which is the first one, emerges in opposition to extended views assuming, between quotation marks, political disenchantment, decreasing levels of participation, etc. And I think the organizing dynamic reveals persistent mobilizations. If we study the last 30 years in the region, we can see that, I mean, the process of mobilization never stopped. It changed forms and changed actors, from trade unions to neighborhood associations to landless movement, and to women participation in different spheres. But the fact that people are creating a togetherness is something that I think is being underscored. And the second one, which is networking, emerges as a result of the routinization of alliances, common fronts, which is something also that we confront very regularly, in the practice of contentious collective action. And I think it challenges the idea of mass organization as privileged locus for collective action. It imposed horizontal deliberation by default, because organizations cannot produce an event by themselves, and on the contrary, events do not occur without the presence of networking practices behind them. lastly, the third non-territorial space, which I called demanding, is my research reveals that an increasing diversity in demands. Just to name a few, high wages, demands for high wages, against the criminalization of social protest, the democratization of the media, agrarian reform, against agribusinesses, redistribution of wealth, expansion of social policy, food sovereignty, etc. On the one hand, these demands reveal a lack of, and on the other hand, a common sense of injustice. Demanding provides, therefore, a contentious collective action with a name that is context-based, and by doing that, it cements a space of solidarity. Needless to say, these three dynamics are interweaved, and we cannot. I have breaking down these known spaces into these three only analytically different dynamics. These three dynamics of non-territorial space are inscribed in one unstable overarching logic, which main characteristic is that it has tended to simplify the political realm in one antagonistic logic. Although the political realm is crossed by multiple conflicts, I argue that one tends to subordinate the rest and becomes dominant or hegemonic. It organizes the place, and it organizes the places and partaking, and somehow it's associated with the notion of externality relationship used by Laclau and Mouffe, a relationship between the structural movement and others that constitute the subjectivity. I have identified basically over the last 30 years three dominant, and this is why I say that it's unstable and changes over time, because in the 80s the struggle for democracy was somehow dominant, whereas in the 90s it was the struggle against or anti-neoliberalism, and in the years 2000 we still kind of don't know, but there is a sense of beyond government, and precisely my argument is that within the 90s and the year 2000, this change in the antagonistic dynamic is crucial to understand what's going on in the production of democratic subjectivities, because while in the 90s the anti-neoliberalism signifier somehow assumed the presence of governments on one side, clearly defined one side. In the year 2000, the idea of beyond government does not assume that, and neither negates that possibility, but that makes it much more complex, and I think somehow affects the current moment of the production of these new democratic subjectivities. In the words of Rancière, this antagonistic moment sets relationships in motion, invent an argument, and connect the unconnected. And somehow we cannot explain. We can explain the depth, the dimension of these non-territorial spaces in relation to this antagonistic dynamic. To conclude, then, the agony of democracy, democratic subjectivity in the region was reflected in the endless production of contentious spaces, which I think have gone through two particular moments. As I said, in the 90s, the anti-neoliberal overarching signifier resulted in high levels of mobilization on the one hand, alongside with high social political conflict. Whereas in the year 2000, the we see a persistent high level of mobilization, but on the other hand with lower social conflict, which is the path somehow, as I argue in the paper, from disagreement to participation, and somehow within this movement, I think we can start understanding this notion of agony of democratic subjectivities in the South. Thank you very much.
So the comments will be provided by Cruz, Chris Cruz, who is a PhD student here at the Department of Politics at the New School for Social Research, and he will have the Herculean task to bring the 4 papers together.
Well, yeah, I made lots of notes, I think, for Mr. Hirsch's paper. It took me 3 pages alone just to try to condense what he'd written down, and then came up with this nice condensed line of summarization. I think rather than trying to sort of restate some of the arguments a lot of you have made, since I think a lot of your arguments are already covered in the papers, I want to highlight first a few things that I think are worth paying attention to in each of the papers, and then try to think about how they're either in discussion with each other or maybe in conflict with each other, depending on what reading we're looking at, what theories or authors we're using, and what sort of context we're looking at. So I'm just going to kind of go down the line just for the sake of simplicity. So I think one of the things I found most interesting about your concept of this organizing, networking, demanding process is that a lot of theories of radical democracy, at least in my experience, tend to come very short when it actually gets to the practice of what radical democracy looks like. We have really great sort of conceptual theories, but when it comes to saying, well, here's actually what's happening on the roadblock, on the ground, or on this land occupation, it's harder to see where the radical theorists offer us a lot of actual real value. So I think by pointing out this sort of framework you're developing of organizing, which pays attention to the fact that these aren't just happening out of nowhere. There's a historical tradition that these come out of. People are identifying with past struggles, building on those and moving forward. But part of what makes that process important is that in that organizing, you have this process of networking, which tends to create a more sort of horizontal or lateral communication structure where people have to negotiate their various interests in order to try to reach concrete demands. So that actually sort of strengthens this sort of deliberative politics going on and puts the sense of sort of agonist politics into actual practice, where different trade unions, old unions, new unions, peasant movements, land reform movements all have to figure out how do we struggle in a shared political context when we may have very different orientations. And then that becomes really important in this sort of third step of demanding, because that's when some sort of agreement is reached and people say, well, here is our name, here are our concrete demands, here's what we're struggling for, and here's what we're struggling against. So you get both this sense of what we're for and what we're against. And this is a theme that I think reoccurs in some of the other papers as well, but you're sort of highlighting it in the Brazilian and Argentinian cases in particular. And I think it's interesting to point out the way that you're sort of mapping it historically. So 80s transition to democracy, everyone was talking about democracy. And then after about 10 years of the honeymoon of democracy, people started saying, well, now actually it's neoliberal democracy and globalization that's the problem. And after sort of 10 years of the neoliberal honeymoon, people are saying, well, maybe actually it's the state that's the problem. We need to be thinking about critiques either of the state or that focus outside of the state. And that's where this sort of concept of organizing, networking, demanding really plays well, because it doesn't necessitate the state or the state forms or state organizations to manage and to sort of expand that sort of a policy. It's a very sort of, in the true sense of grassroots, sort of a grassroots approach. And then one of the things that's interesting, and you guys really can't see this because you don't have the paper in front of you, but you developed these sort of interesting visuals. Now, do you have a copy you could hold up maybe just for people to see of the FRNAPO and CMS case together? Because what he's trying to do is show how all these various networks in space actually come together. And so you can start to see...
Very small, sorry.
But it's very interesting in that you start to see where, well, this one group, whether it was the CMS in Brazil or the FRNAPO, which are basically two different sort of popular fronts of many organizations, that certain groups sort of seem to be like central hubs for organizing activity and sort of coalition building. But you also see some places where networks that existed previously have dropped off, and Group A and Group B aren't maybe in conjunction with conversation, but now A is talking to C, D, E, F, and G, whereas before maybe only one or two were happening. And as I understand your argument, part of this is what's happening in this networking, organizing, and sort of demanding process. So I found that really interesting. The last thing, just quickly, is that I think it's really important to help sort of reorient us to think about what do radical democratic theories, what do agonistic politics look like if we look at it as a purely grassroots concern and not at a state structural or international or even sort of global agonistic political level. Okay, and then I'll just point out a couple sort of problems or concerns that I think you might want to pay attention to. One in particular is, so with these models of the CMS and FRENAPO in Brazil and Argentina, how do they actually help us understand the process of producing democratic subjects? So you talk about these three dynamics as sort of helping us to understand the depth of sort of subject formation and the form that it takes and the way sort of different identities are produced. But I think it would be helpful to try to map out more in the actual sort of maybe in a Butler-Foucauldian sense of performativity. How are they actually performing their subject positions, or how are they being formed by other groups in that process? So trying to actually pinpoint a little more clearly the actual how you understand the sort of democratic subjectivity occurring both inside these movements and sort of as a movement from disagreements and demanding to actual political agreements and organizing a sort of shared dissolution. The other one is just purely structural for the paper. I think you need to lay out a little better information about how and what the diagrams are showing, because it's not always clear, you know, is this saying that the networks are getting bigger, or this one group sort of the new hegemon and has coalesced all of these different arguments, and maybe it's not as agonistic as we think because they found a way to quell all the other opposition. So just clarifying a little bit more how you're using the sort of two case studies, specifically in the visuals, how you constructed them. The other thing that I was looking for that didn't come out, because you talk a lot about the importance of these sort of contested discourses or process of forming discussions and collaborations through these actual connections, which are largely play through organizing discussions and discourses about issues. So how do we come to agreement on something? But what I think would be useful is to actually do a little bit more of a true discourse analysis within these groups and try to show, you know, on a sort of a linguistic level, on other sort of, you know, language levels, how is this process forming? And then finally, it would be interesting to have a little more sort of actual nuts and bolts of the how of the organizing of the network. How does it happen? In what ways? What does work and what doesn't? And what's being learned sort of through this process? Okay, on to transition to justice, or transitional justice. I'll admit that this is of the four papers, the one that I have the least background on, even though I've read some Agamben. This is a whole new field of the Agamben discussions, and I don't know Wallen or Amory or Connolly really, so a lot of what you're arguing, I had a hard time telling if I would agree or disagree based on your reading of them. But there's a couple things that I think are really interesting to point attention to. One is this, one of the problems that you point out is that transitional justice and theories looking at transitional justice sort of hit a wall, because somehow they magically assume consensus. And through that consensus and probably constitutional law, we can make an agreement. Well, agonism sort of says, it's not how it works. We don't just kind of magically get together and, you know, the Tutsis and the Hutus just forget about what happened and they reconcile each other. Something has to happen beyond just magically hoping that consensus will appear out of nowhere. And so looking for ways to do that, you go to Agamben, you go to Wallen, Amory. In particular, you sort of look at Agamben and say, well, he's useful in that, and particularly talking about his work on trauma at Auschwitz, that he brings forward this notion of unforgettability and unimaginability, or what this concept of non-responsibility. At some point, we can't take responsibility, but we can't get away from the responsibility of acknowledging that. and that sort of creates a trauma, but also this problem which you sort of describe, or maybe Agamben describes as messianic time, where we're always sort of waiting for something to reconcile itself that in some ways never can really reconcile itself. And that sort of puts Agamben in this position of what you could say is a circular or a tautological logic with messianic time. And then his conception of messianic time links with both this notion of non-responsibility and, as I understand it, how he tries to address this, which is through concepts of shame and intimacy leading to a form of reconciliation, particularly doing a reading of sadomasochism and the relationship between the sadist and the masochist, where one relies on the other one in a sort of quasi-Hegelian master-slave relationship to create each other's identity or produce each other. But the problem you're pointing out with this sort of notion is that, and I think you used Connolly to argue this as well, at the end of the day, it seems like this is just sort of another liberal tolerance argument in disguise. And really, if we're trying to move away from consensus and toleration, then what Agamben's doing doesn't actually help us do that. In fact, it might make it more problematic because we're stuck in this time of no time, some way we can't move out, but we need to do something where there's no resolution. And so you suggest that, well, actually, Amory is where one place we should be looking, because this notion of resentment and the ethic of resentment actually gives us a way to sort of pin the crimes on people and create moral boundaries and sort of define ethics because of political action and the implications, but also allows us, in a sense, to move forward from that by actually using that process of acknowledgement and sort of in a process, I think you talked about a sublimation of internalizing that, but then using that awareness to then sort of create a new subjectivity and move forward so that it doesn't become frozen, debilitating, but it actually gives you a way to recognize what has happened, prioritize the ethical problems with it, and then continue to move forward even if there's not pure, total reconciliation of the issue. And then this is where you argue that Wolin's notion of fugitive reconciliation in particular is really useful, because here it really highlights this notion of difference and agonism, but also pays attention to questions of collective memory and the role that memory plays both in ruptures and in sort of healing ruptures, or finding a way to, if not heal them, at least maintain and manage them in a way that can be sort of useful in an agonistic framework. And so by sort of using Omri there, you're suggesting sort of taking it back out of the Agamben notion and more towards Wolin's notion that this really is a very useful way to think about reconciliation from an agonistic standpoint. So you sort of end by suggesting that maybe democracy is actually a tactic of agonistic repair, and that it plays out in this concept of fugitive time in our sort of contemporary post-conflict milieu. One of the two things that I think you want to be mindful of is you basically argue that for a theory of responsibility, we should be framing it around resentment, remembrance, and non-identity instead of intimacy, respect, and similitude. And I want to sort of question if sort of throwing out intimacy, respect, and similitude really is the way to go, and if that is necessary because of using Agamben or necessary because of the way they function within responsibility in a more bigger context of theorizing. The other thing in particular to pay attention to is that at the end of the day, where does agonistic reconciliation leave us if democracy is just sort of these temporal outbursts but isn't an actual process or a system? So what happens all the rest of the time so we don't have these agonistic democratic outbreaks? Jumping down next, Mr. Singh, and again, also you highlight, I think, very well this sort of role of world social form, Zapatistas, and the sort of emerging discourse against neoliberalism and against what Escobar calls a sort of imperial globality that is basically the new face of liberal democracy today. And you say, well, I like Mouffe and want to sort of be sensitive to her project, but also like she has all these blinders on that are really problematic if we're serious about using Mouffe in your ideas. And I think the 6 sort of critiques you make are very useful and very insightful. this sort of notion of we just talk a lot about radical democracy, but when it comes to actually enacting it, there's not much actual substance there, I think is spot on. This concept of hegemony itself goes back to some of these other discourses. We can't seem to think about radical democracy outside of the state, and I think you're sort of pointing to that problem is very useful. And then I think it also plays into this notion of the singularity of values. As you mentioned, sort of radical, revolutionary, indigenous, subaltern, insurgent politics essentially get just sort of pushed to the side and out of the picture because they don't want to agree to this liberal democratic hegemony that's the ticket to entry into this sort of political discourse. I think that's something a lot of discourses need to pay more attention to in particular. And then this notion that there is almost nothing outside of the liberal democratic tradition, that radical democracy is just sort of re-inscription back into that entire process, I think is important because there seems to be an assumption that by making a radical democratic theory, you somehow bypassed all the problems of neoliberalism and liberal democratic discourses and discourses on modernity and sort of primitive cultures and third world realities are somehow different from the high-tech modern world. And sort of, which is what you're pointing to in the last critique, which is coloniality is really reinscribed in modernity itself, and that we need to be highly attentive to that. And I think that's something that even most of the radical democratic theorists I know don't even pay, they're not aware of either. Their blinders are so deep on that. And so I think one of the interesting questions you raise here is that is a discussion about radical democracy really possible within a framework of the liberal democratic state, or do we actually need to be thinking outside of the state itself because the state is so possibly implicated in modernity? Now, one or two of the problems that I think you want to pay attention to in this argument is that can we then actually talk about a democratic politics that's global, or is that a contradiction in terms? Can we only talk about local democratic politics and sort of local radical democracies, not one sort of global framework for what radical democracy might mean? And then I also want to question whether this use of the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction, which you sort of bring in through Mouffe and sort of a big part of her project, is that actually a useful way to think about agonistic politics, or does that actually problematize more because of Schmidt's problems of understanding the political, how we might then understand the political through Schmidt, through Mouffe, through radical democracy? Okay, and then finally, I don't know why I jumped over, maybe it's the artist in me. So this question of the turn to the social and art, which Rancière has been sort of the key figure you highlight and a lot of people highlight in. Read through Zmijewski's work, am I saying it right? Zmijewski's work, sorry, and I live in a Polish neighborhood. I found really interesting because in a sense this is sort of the dissensus, the disagreement, the agonistic politics like in play through sort of a microcosm of four groups saying, okay, you create, produce your subjects and then contest your subjects and then reproduce your subjects, and let's not set boundaries on how you do that and see what happens. And that was actually for the artist a key part of what he thought was important, and what you were sort of pointing to is also important. Working on Heart Negri, saying that we could see this in a Rancièrean sort of example of disagreement, but we could also look at it in the context of producing sort of a richer democracy, or what Heart Negri sort of talk about within their discussion of a richer reality of subject formation. And so you're essentially looking at performativity as an art sort of function, the way that both subjectivity is produced and the commons is produced, but then also sort of how they feed back in sort of a cybernetic sense into each other. And you argue that, well, part of the problem is that there's an inherent tendency of exploitation by the artists of the sort of art as a medium, but also possibly people involved in performance art. This sort of reinforces the capitalist exploitation model. But maybe the downside to that is the upside, which is that art actually may be more free because of its sort of less political nature, or less direct sort of political impacts in sort of policy discussions and the biopolitical realities, that they can push boundaries and push ethical norms and question things that otherwise that imagined space couldn't be possible to have, so that art actually sort of creates a space that then new actual political practices can move into. Trying to really, I think, foregrounding that concept is really important. And so you're saying pay attention to this notion of production, but production in italics to help kind of highlight that, I think is really good. The two main questions I had, or concerns, is that it seems like you're working with a somewhat sort of high art hegemonic understanding of art in sort of quotations. So I can think of long traditions of art that aren't new, that have always been concerned with the social and have always been functioning basically as sort of experimental or laboratory sites. And so why should we accept this argument about a new social turn in art through Rancière and others, when I can think of earlier examples, Emory Douglas and the Black Panthers, among others, where there's a long continuity of radical political art that's not new in any way, and it's always been a form of experimentation. And that maybe art is more limited because today it relies so much on corporate patronage and philanthropy that it's lost its ability to actually open up new social imaginaries, because the social imaginaries within art have already been foreclosed by what can be funded, what can be put in a gallery, what can be considered as art. But the sort of challenge to that would be, so if you took your example in the studio out into reality, would that sort of agonistic experimentation be productive the way that it was in the studio? Do we want people coming together, having a conflict, and burning down buildings because they disagree as a form of their expression? In the studio, it works well as a way to reconcile and sort of maintain this agonistic consensus. But when that goes outside of the gallery, what happens to that sort of art politics? And then I know I'm out of time, so I'm just going to point to a few quick linkages and then hand it over to Andreas. I think the one thing I want to highlight in all these discussions that I think really is critical to hopefully the rest of this conference and discussions is, can we really think about radical democracy in the context of liberal democratic states? Because there seems to be a lot of questions about whether or not we can do that or not. But then more importantly, when we talk about radical democracy, and this is something in our class that maybe sort of led in part to this conference, when we talk about radical democracy, do we think of it as a tendency, as a movement, as an institutional form? Because those different sort of conceptualizations will have radically different implications for both where we think theory should go and what we think theory can do. If we're trying to do like Mouffe and recapture the liberal democratic state, and that points us in particular directions. If we're talking about autonomous land movements where we're trying to reclaim land for peasants, then maybe the questions of state and global democracy are the wrong way altogether to approach it. And then finally, the question is, what actually makes sort of a concept of agonistic politics better than discourse of hegemonic liberal democracy? Because in a lot of ways, the assumption in all of these discourses around agonism is that we can reconcile our differences in a way where it doesn't lead to people cutting each other's fingers and heads off. And is that actually a safe assumption to make about agonism and being able to bound itself in a way that's actually politically productive for a bigger project?
Thank you. The speakers give the chance to respond and to engage with the comments. I think it's time also to open it up for questions and discussion with the audience as well. And then you will have the opportunity to answer all the questions together. So let's start with questions. Nothing?
Too tired.
Too early, yeah? Yes.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Harry. I was on just the note that Chris just ended in. I was very interested that in your presentation, I mean, I'm very unfamiliar with the domain of the artwork, but the thing that you wanted to seize upon was this question of the exploitation by the artist or the performers. If you'd stopped just after sort of laying out the nature of the artwork, the thing that I thought you would have seized upon is the fact that they burnt down somebody else's artwork. Now, I'm wondering, is this something which other people have spoken about and therefore was sort of too obvious to be of interest, or was, I mean, Chris sort of maybe read your reading of that you thought that that was actually more of something that we could understand as just being in the nature of the cut and thrust of, you know, identity formation. And yeah, so I'm wondering, how did I saw that it wasn't this key part of your paper, but how did you conceive of, or how did the artist conceive of this sort of quite violent sort of end to the thing? And is that something that's produced? I mean, that seemed to me maybe a case that, you know, maybe it points to certain dangers, but on the other hand, maybe it points to there's something about art as a laboratory there that led to less communal responses than you would have in real life. Actually, in real life, you have some sense of, oh, well, maybe I want to burn down their building, but that's not a way to live together. Whereas in the artist's studio, there's this sense of, yeah, we're supposed to live up to certain identities, even though the artist's not telling you what to do, but you want to show that. I'm wondering, how did you conceive of this?
Well, firstly, that idea of like living up to identities, I think, is incredibly important in terms of like this sort of performative social turn. This kind of Butler idea of essentially these people they're no longer individuals, they're no longer themselves, they are representing the identity that they're purported to represent. I think that's like really crucial. I can't remember whether I wrote it in the kind of extended version of this or not. The burning thing it's kind of interesting. It was that was the most, when this work was initially kind of shown and the first responses came to it, this was the one thing that everyone focused on, was the burning. And everyone saw it as this massively, you know, destructive kind of entropic act of like, you know, destroying any kind of destroying the whole process, which up until that point had been really discursive and dialogical. But actually, when you look at it, it's kind of, I mean, in a still, it's really difficult to get this across, but this burning takes on, because it's in an art context, it takes on a really aesthetic quality. The way that they do it, the way that it actually happens is really interesting, because they don't, you know, someone doesn't go sort of crazy in a fit of pique and throws petrol and chucks the lighter on. It's this really like, I am now going to burn this canvas, and, you know, stating their intention. And then there's this very thorough process of making sure that there's enough petrol, and that, you know,
making sure the other group members aren't.
Making sure, no, exactly. Everyone is at a safe distance, and there's this. It becomes this really weird symbolic act, and everyone stands there and watches it, like for, you know, a couple of minutes, and then once the smoke starts filling up a bit too much, then they all leave together, and it's this really weird thing. There's no sense of panic about it. There's no sense of like. Of you know, it's not an action of pique, of anger, of rage. It's this. My reading of it anyway is that it becomes like another kind of symbolic sort of discursive action. What's also interesting is the way that in this art context, people like turn towards aesthetic forms of argument, which I think this piece works really well to display. This idea that, like you say, people wouldn't necessarily go around burning, especially not in that way, not in that I'm going to symbolically burn this.
But it sounds like they wouldn't even do it in
no.
They wouldn't do it in the I'm going to sneak around and blow it up in the middle of the night either. So.
No, yeah. So I think that's a really interesting kind of specificity of art, is this, it alters people's relations and reactions and actions. And that on the one hand could be exactly part of this like laboratory thing. It could be a source of improved discussion, or of a different form of discussion, or it could completely debase the whole thing. I'm not quite sure yet, just by virtue of the fact that people are performing rather than being themselves in some way. Does that maybe destroy the whole